Super is going to be the biggest asset a lot of people own when they retire. For example, a 30-year-old on about $80,000 today could end up with close to $1 million in super by age 65. So, not understanding it is a bit like that one parent you convinced to get the newest iPhone on a contract and who now mostly uses it as a digital phone book to find your number and call you from a landline to let you know that suspicious magpie is back again. Hello and welcome to Acting on Finance. I'm your host David, a man with a rational fear of spiders, heights and shared urinals. Now before we get into it, quick note, this is for education, not financial advice. Although if I was giving advice, it would be mainly to avoid shared urinals entirely. It's an unnecessarily high pressure environment, there are too many unspoken rules and no one seems entirely comfortable. Superannuation. You've seen it written, you've heard it spoken, and there's a fair chance you've got absolutely no interest in it whatsoever. Well, that changes today. Today we're doing Super 101. That's the basics of what it is, how it works, why it matters, and why ignoring it can quietly cost you a lot more money while you remain heroically focused on other things like whether your Uber Eats driver has taken an aggressively scenic route to you. So rather than complicate this and descend into a long, boring speech involving phrases like retirement benefit, wealth accumulation strategy, or compare the pair, I'm going to break this down into a few simple questions. So, what is super? Well, depending on who you ask, super gets described in a lot of different ways. Some people say it's like a bank account, others say it's like a vehicle. Some say it's a lockbox, which is helpful in the sense that these are all words we recognize, but not particularly helpful in understanding what's actually happening. Because in reality, super is much closer to a Horcrux. It's a piece of your income you've deliberately separated from your day-to-day life, invested and locked away with the intention of extending your financial life after you stop working. Which sounds dramatic and slightly copyright infringement-y, but is essentially what's happening. Also, creating an account involves a fairly questionable process and general willingness to embrace the darker side of things. I mean, have you ever dealt with a super fund before? And once you get past the slightly dramatic metaphors, super is actually very simple. It's just money you or your employer put aside to invest, grow, and then use specifically when you retire. And why should you care about it? Because life moves strangely. When you're young, time flies. It's like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, sweeping landscapes, momentum, young, sexy Orlando Bloom getting a horse with unreasonable confidence, huge battles, everyone walking for 3 films and yet it feels quick. And then as you get older, it shifts into The Hobbit. Still recognizable, still expensive, but now it's much longer than it needed to be and strangely stretched out. And there's a noticeably older, still sexy Orlando Bloom once again getting off a horse as if no time has passed for anyone involved except the viewer. And then retirement arrives and suddenly it's the Rings of Power. Long. Very long. Somehow things are much more expensive, yet with remarkably little actually happening. The point is, retirement feels far away now until one day it absolutely is not. And how much super you have will directly impact how enjoyable it is, how long it can be funded for, and whether you spend it traveling to Europe or aggressively comparing tinned tomatoes on a Tuesday morning because they're 40 cents cheaper 2 aisles over. And secondly, put simply, it's your money. Why wouldn't you care? So how does money get into super? And this is where we begin what is traditionally the confusing journey of super. Because super itself is not a difficult concept. It's everything built around it that feels confusing, as though it was designed by people paid per acronym. Broadly speaking, money gets in 3 ways. First, could be through your employer putting money in, which is called the super guarantee, currently 12%. Second, you can use salary sacrifice, where you choose to send some of your pre-tax salary into super instead of receiving it in your pay. And third, you can make personal contributions, yourself, usually by transferring money in the same way you transfer money to a bank account, with a BSB, an account number, or through BPay with a reference. Somehow, the least confusing part of super is the banking bit. These contributions then fall into 2 categories. Concessional contributions, which are the pre-tax ones, such as the employer contributions or salary sacrifice, or even one of those personal contributions you then later claim a tax deduction for. Or they can be non-concessional contributions, which are generally after tax. It's money you've already paid tax on, and then you choose to add it to super, but not claim any tax deduction. And if that already sounds mildly confusing, don't feel like you're the only one. This isn't like that time you saw Tenet with your mate who loves Nolan and couldn't stop raving about it, but all you could think was, wait, what? Now here is why people bother with super. If you were to earn $10,000 and you're on a 32% tax rate, including Medicare, when your employer pays you, the ATO will take about 32%, meaning you keep about $6,800. If that same $10,000 went into super at a concessional rate, it would generally be taxed at 15%, meaning you get about 85% remaining afterwards. And that is where the benefit of super starts to show itself. But getting money into super is not the only thing you have to navigate. You also need to know how much you're allowed to put in. The concessional cap is currently $30,000 per year, increasing to $32,500 from the 1st of July. The non-concessional cap is currently $120,000 per year, increasing to $130,000 from 1st July. How is super taxed while you're working? Well, while you're building wealth inside your super, you're generally in what's called the accumulation phase. This is a stage where money is going in, investments are growing, and earnings inside super are generally taxed more favorably than they would be outside it, mostly at that 15% rate. And over time, that matters enormously, because the money does not just grow once. The returns can generate returns, and then those returns generate returns, and then those returns begin generating returns of their own. It's like the MCU, but without the returns diminishing over the years. That is compounding. Growth, building on previous growth over long periods of time, is the kind of thing that does a lot of work quietly in the background without you really noticing at the time, but becomes very obvious when you look back later on. Like realizing we were right at the beginning of the reconnaissance in 2011, at a time when ghosts of girlfriends past were still recent enough to make that seem wildly unlikely. And how is your super invested? This is the part that gets missed constantly. Super itself is not an investment. It is a tax structure containing investments. Your money still needs to be invested into something. Depending on where your super is held, it may be invested in shares, managed funds, ETFs, property, infrastructure, bonds, cash, term deposits, or a mixture of all of them. For many people, that happens through an industry fund. Think Australian Super, Hester, or similar. And many members sit in default investment options with names like conservative, balanced, or growth. These are essentially pre-built options where the fund pools money together and manages the investing on your behalf. Some people are in options without really understanding them. Some genuinely have no idea what they're invested in, which is a bit like buying a car with a note saying, runs perfectly, just ignore the tapping sound coming from the boot. Generally speaking, a conservative or cash-heavy option is usually less risky than a growth option. A diversified option is usually less risky than a concentrated tech option, and a leveraged option is usually riskier than common sense itself, which is why it is so important to know how you're invested. So it's worth making sure you understand what you're invested in and how you feel about risk. How do you access your super? In 2 words, you don't. Not yet. At this point, a fairly obvious question tends to come up. If super is so tax effective, why not just put everything you can into it? Well, because you lose access to the money for a long time. Super is a preserved environment, meaning the money is generally locked away until you meet a condition of release, usually reaching preservation age and retiring, or simply age 65. Why? Well, because this whole system is designed to fund retirement, so it makes sense the money's locked away until then. Now this can feel restrictive, because it is. But it is also the only reason the system works, because if people could access their super freely, they would, immediately, and often for reasons that feel completely justified at the time, like thinking it's wise to fund a star-studded movie adaptation of the Broadway hit Cats. So yes, the lack of access is frustrating, but it's also the feature that enforces long-term discipline many people would struggle to maintain on their own. And what happens when you retire? This is where super becomes particularly powerful. Once you meet that condition of release, you can move from the accumulation phase into the retirement phase and commence a pension. That means instead of building the balance, you begin drawing an income stream from it. And in many cases, the tax on earnings in this phase can drop to 0%. So you could theoretically draw $100,000 a year from your pension and pay no tax on that income, which is about as close as finance gets to someone bending the rules in your favor, but in a way that's intentional and legal and not a Panama Papers, Mossack Fonseca kind of way. Death benefit nominations. Now, unlike Hugh Jackman in his career, none of us will go on forever. In fact, we could pass away tomorrow, next week, in 20 years, or in Hugh Jackman's case, I assume 4, maybe 500 years from now, which means eventually your super is likely going to go to someone else. And this is where death benefit nominations matter. A death benefit nomination is your direction to the super fund about who should receive your super if you die. But unlike ordinary assets, you can't simply nominate anyone you'd like because super has rules. Generally speaking, valid recipients are usually a spouse, child, someone financially dependent on you, someone in an interdependency relationship with you, or your legal personal representative, which basically means your estate. If you nominate someone who is not a valid beneficiary, that nomination may fail. If you make no valid nomination at all, the benefit may be left to the trustee's discretion. And this is where things get awkward. Let's say you list your sibling as a beneficiary. Later you get a partner of 1 or 2 years, but still want your sibling to receive the money. To be thorough and appropriately morbid, you also put it in your will. Then you pass away. Despite all your planning, it is not guaranteed to go where you expected. Why? Because a sibling is not automatically a valid beneficiary unless they qualify under the dependency rules. And super is not an estate asset, meaning it does not automatically form part of your estate. Remember, it's a horcrux, all on its own. What should you do now? Where people tend to run into problems with super is not because the system doesn't work, it's because they look at it, see unfamiliar words, feel overwhelmed, and then retreat immediately. Much like me at a shared urinal. I know I should do something, but instead I stare straight ahead for the requisite 30 seconds and then walk away defeated and embarrassed that I still need to pee, having learnt nothing. So start here. Find out where your super is. Who holds it? Do you have multiple accounts from an old job quietly charging duplicate fees? Have you got lost super sitting somewhere in the financial wilderness under an employee you forgot existed? Then check fees. Administration fees, investment fees, percentage-based fees. What are you paying and how does it compare elsewhere? Because tiny percentages over decades can quietly become very real money. Then check what you are invested in. Are you in a default balanced option? Because no one ever asked? Is there a more suitable option for your age, goals, and tolerance for market movement? Then check insurance. Many super funds include default insurance. It's sometimes useful, sometimes poor value, and sometimes both at once. And finally, check your death benefit nominations and ensure they're valid, current, and still reflect reality. Fun fact, divorce does not invalidate a death benefit nomination. So divorced dads, put down the TV dinner, quit watching women's volleyball for athleticism, and go check your nomination. None of this is especially complicated, but it does require paying attention for longer than most people would prefer. So that was a basic look at super. It's not perfect, it has rules, it is restrictive, and it requires a level of patience that most people would not naturally choose, particularly in a world where waiting 12 seconds for a web page to load feels like an act of oppression. But it is one of the most powerful long-term financial systems many Australians have access to. Ignore it, and it may still do something useful. Understand it, and it can do considerably more. Now there's a lot in here, and this has been a 101 style video. I'll go deeper on the concepts we covered individually, so there's more time for you to understand, digest, and be slightly less bored by them. So if you found this helpful, feel free to like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Or if you want to see me somehow relate something like interest rate volatility to Kieran Culkin's character arc in Home Alone, delivered with the tone of a news reporter who's slightly too upbeat about that house fire, let me know.